At the dinner, my brother demanded my $700,000 store. My parents threatened to disown me. I left. A week later, his boss bought it. He begged, "Please stop this." I replied, "I don't forgive greed." It was a Tuesday evening, raining sideways against my living room window, when the intercom buzzed. I was 30 years old, exhausted to my bones, and just trying to get through another week without crying myself to sleep. It had been exactly 6 months since I buried my husband, Harrison Caldwell. 6 months of running our organic food store all by myself, keeping a smile plastered on my face for the customers while my insides felt like crushed glass. I pressed the button on the intercom, expecting the delivery guy with my takeout. Instead, I heard my older brother's voice, overly loud and dripping with that fake charm he always used when he wanted something. I buzzed Preston in, already feeling a migraine creeping up the back of my neck. When I opened my apartment door, he was standing there shaking off his expensive umbrella. Preston is 32, but he still dresses and acts like a frat boy who thinks the world owes him a favor just for breathing. He didn't even ask how I was doing. He just strolled right into my kitchen, opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. He started with small talk, complimenting my apartment, asking if the store was busy, but I knew him better than that. Preston never visited me unless he had messed up. After about 5 minutes of beating around the bush, he finally dropped the act. He looked at me, rubbed the back of his neck, and put on his best puppy dog eyes. He told me he was in a tight spot. A really tight spot. Apparently, his latest get-rich-quick scheme had gone belly up, and he owed some dangerous people a lot of money. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me for a $50,000 loan. I just stared at him. $50,000. He said it so casually, like he was asking me to spot him for a coffee. I asked him where on earth he thought I had 50 grand just sitting around. That's when the mask slipped. He gestured vaguely toward the window, implying the store downtown. He said, and I quote, that Harrison's little grocery hobby was sitting on a gold mine, and since I was just a widow running it alone, I could easily pull a line of credit against the property to bail him out. My blood ran cold. The sheer audacity of him standing in my home, calling my dead husband's life work a little grocery hobby, made my hands shake. I told him absolutely not. I reminded him of the crypto scam he fell for 3 years ago, the failed drop shipping business before that, and the time he wrecked his car drunk and our parents paid for it. I told him I was barely keeping my own head above water with grief, and I wasn't about to mortgage Harrison's legacy to cover his gambling or whatever stupid investment he ruined this time. Preston didn't take it well. His face flushed red, the fake charm completely vanishing. He stepped closer to me, trying to use his height to intimidate me, something he used to do when we were teenagers. He sneered and called me a greedy, selfish bitch. He said I was hoarding wealth while my own flesh and blood was drowning. I pointed to the door and told him to get out before I called the police. He grabbed his coat, storming out into the hallway. But right before the elevator doors closed, he pointed a finger at me and shouted that Mom and Dad would hear about this, and they were going to fix it. I locked the deadbolt, sliding down the door until I hit the floor, burying my face in my hands. Little did I know, he had already set the trap. 3 days later, my mother, Diane, invited me to a family dinner. I should have known it was an ambush. I really should have. But when you are drowning in grief, sometimes you stupidly cling to the hope that your family might actually want to comfort you. I drove up to my parents' large suburban house, the house I grew up in, a place where I always felt like a ghost. I walked into the dining room. The table was set with Mom's fancy china, a massive pot roast in the center. My father, Wallace, was already seated at the head of the table, sipping a glass of scotch. Preston was sitting across from my usual spot, swirling a glass of wine, looking incredibly smug. The air in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. No one asked how my week was. No one asked how I was sleeping. We just started eating in agonizing silence. About 10 minutes into the meal, Diane put her fork down. She dabbed her mouth with a cloth napkin, cleared her throat, and looked directly at me. She didn't ease into it. She didn't sugarcoat it. She simply stated that the family was in a financial crisis because of Preston's debts and that it was time for me to step up. I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. I asked her what she meant by stepping up. Wallace chimed in, using his stern, patriarchal voice that was supposed to make me shrink into myself. He said that a single woman had no business running a commercial property downtown anyway. He said the store was currently valued at roughly $700,000 on the open market. Then, Diane dropped the bomb. She looked me straight in the eyes and demanded that I sign the deed of the store over to Preston. Not sell it to him. Not let him manage it. Sign the ownership completely over to him, so he could either sell it or take a massive commercial loan against it to clear his debts and start fresh. The room went dead silent. I could hear my own heart hammering in my ears. I looked at Preston, who was trying to hide a smirk behind his wine glass. They wanted me to surrender Harrison's legacy. They wanted me to hand over the very walls that smelled like my husband, the shelves we built together, the business we poured our entire savings into, all to save the golden boy from his own incompetence. I tried to keep my voice steady. I told them that the store was all I had left of Harrison. I told them it was my livelihood, my only source of income, and the only reason I was getting out of bed in the morning. Diane slammed her hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. She called me a dramatic, ungrateful child. She yelled that Harrison was dead and clinging to a building wasn't going to bring him back. She said family comes first and Preston needed the money now. Then Wallace delivered the final blow. He leaned forward, pointing a finger at me. He said if I refused to sign the property over to my brother, I was no longer their daughter. He told me I would be completely disowned, cut off from the family, and entirely on my own in this world. They expected me to break. They expected the scared little girl who always gave in to her brother to just nod, cry, and sign her life away. But something inside me snapped. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at the three of them, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, but who only saw me as an ATM for their favorite child. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I calmly placed my cloth napkin on the table, stood up, grabbed my purse, and looked right at my father. I told him to have a nice life, and I walked out the front door. I didn't drive home after that dinner. I couldn't. My apartment felt too suffocating. Instead, my hands steered my old sedan toward downtown on autopilot. I parked in the alley behind the store and unlocked the heavy back door. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar, comforting smell hit me. It was a mixture of roasted coffee beans, fresh organic soil, and the deep, earthy scent of cedar wood. I didn't turn on the main overhead lights. I just walked through the aisles in the soft glow of the street lamps, filtering through the front display windows. I ran my fingers along the rough edges of the wooden shelves. Harrison had built these by hand. I remembered the blisters on his palms, the sawdust in his hair, the way he laughed when he accidentally nailed his own shirt to a display rack. We had practically lived in this building for 2 years before we opened. I designed the logo, painted the signs, and set up the marketing, while he negotiated with local farmers and built the physical foundation of our dream. This place wasn't a $700,000 asset to me. It was a living, breathing testament to the man I loved. I walked up to the front counter and sat on the stool behind the register. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. I remembered the night he died. It was a terrible storm, much like the rain earlier this week. He was driving back from a local dairy farm in a neighboring county, trying to secure a new vendor for our organic cheese section. A drunk driver ran a red light at an intersection. The police called me at 2 in the morning. By the time I reached the hospital, he was already gone. My parents didn't come to the hospital that night. They said it was too late to drive in the rain and that they would see me in the morning. But they didn't show up until the afternoon, and even then, Diane spent the entire time complaining about the hospital coffee. Preston didn't even show up to the funeral because he was nursing a hangover from a weekend trip to Vegas. Sitting there in the dark store, wrapping my arms around myself, the sheer weight of their betrayal finally hit me. They had never cared about my happiness. They had never cared about Harrison. To them, my life was just collateral damage in their desperate mission to keep Preston from facing the consequences of his own actions. A heavy, dark anger started to pool in my stomach. It was a new feeling. For 30 years, I had been the peacekeeper. I had swallowed my pride, accepted the hand-me-downs, ignored the blatant favoritism, and convinced myself that if I just worked hard enough, they would eventually be proud of me. But in this quiet, empty store, surrounded by my dead husband's dreams, I realized the truth. They were never going to love me the way they loved him. They were going to bleed me dry and leave me with nothing. I opened my eyes and looked at the framed photograph of Harrison and me on opening day, hanging right above the register. He was smiling so brightly, holding me tight against his side. I made a silent promise to him right then and there. I promised I would protect this place. I promised I would burn my relationship with my family to the absolute ground before I let Preston take a single dime of Harrison's money. The grief was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. I thought walking out of that dinner would be the end of it for a while. I figured they would give me the silent treatment, which was their usual tactic when I stepped out of line. I was dead wrong. They didn't retreat, they escalated. It was a busy Thursday afternoon. The store was packed with our regular customers, people picking up fresh produce and organic pastries for the weekend. I was working the main register, chatting with a sweet older lady about her garden, when the little bell above the front door chimed. I looked up and felt my stomach drop to the floor. Diane and Wallace were marching through the aisles, looking like they were on a warpath. They didn't wait in line. They pushed right past 2 customers and planted themselves directly in front of my register. Diane slammed her leather handbag onto the counter, knocking over a display of artisan chocolate bars. The entire front of the store went completely quiet. People stopped mid-conversation. Diane raised her voice, intentionally making sure every single person in the store could hear her. She asked me how I could sleep at night. She yelled that I was a cold, heartless woman who was sitting on a mountain of money while my own brother was about to lose everything. She accused me of stealing the store from the family, as if they had ever contributed a single penny or a drop of sweat to this place. I felt my face burn with humiliation. Customers were staring, some looking horrified, others whispering to each other. I kept my voice low, hoping to de-escalate the situation. I asked them to please step into the back office so we could talk in private, that this was a place of business and they were scaring the customers. Wallace scoffed loudly. He pointed his finger in my face, his voice booming across the produce section. He told the entire room that I was a widow who had lost her mind, that I was hoarding my dead husband's wealth and refusing to help my struggling family. He said I was a disgrace to the Mitchell name. The strategy was obvious. They wanted to publicly humiliate me into submission. They thought if they created a big enough scene, if they embarrassed me in front of the community Harrison and I had built, I would fold just to make the screaming stop. For a split second, the old Clara, the terrified little girl, wanted to give them whatever they wanted just to make them go away. But then I looked down at the wooden counter Harrison had sanded. I took a deep breath, picked up the store phone, and dialed the local police precinct's non-emergency number. I looked right at my mother and father, my voice completely steady. I told them they had exactly 2 minutes to leave my property before they were formally charged with trespassing and harassment. Diane's jaw dropped. She couldn't believe I was actually fighting back. She sputtered, calling me a monster, but when she saw me speaking to the dispatcher on the phone, the bravado faded. Wallace grabbed her arm, his face purple with rage. He leaned in close and whispered that I was going to pay for this, that they would make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person I was. They stormed out, kicking the door open on their way. I had to spend the next hour apologizing to my customers, fighting back tears of absolute mortification. But I didn't break. My parents made good on their threat. When they realized they couldn't bully me face to face, they decided to destroy my reputation from the outside in. Birmingham is a big city, but our specific suburban community and the circles my parents ran in were tight-knit. Over the next week, the Whisper campaign began, and it was brutal. It started with the voicemails. My phone would light up, and it would be my Aunt Sylvia. I played one of her messages while sitting in my kitchen. Her voice was dripping with fake concern and heavy judgment. She said she couldn't believe what Diane had told her. She said I was being incredibly selfish, that Harrison would be ashamed of me for turning my back on my own flesh and blood over a piece of real estate. She told me to do the Christian thing and give the store to Preston before God punished me for my greed. I deleted the message, my hands shaking. Then came social media. My cousin Bethany, who literally hasn't worked a day in her life and lives off her husband's trust fund, started posting passive-aggressive paragraphs on Facebook. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. She wrote long posts about toxic family members who let money corrupt their souls, and how some people use their grief as an excuse to be wicked to their parents. My mother and her entire country club friend group were liking and commenting on it, validating the lies. But the worst part was the real-world isolation. I went to a local coffee shop on a Sunday morning, a place I had been going to for 5 years. I saw Mrs. Higgins, an older woman who used to bring Harrison and me cookies when we were painting the store. I smiled and waved at her. She looked right at me, her face tightening with disgust, and literally turned her back to me, walking out of the shop without ordering. The narrative my parents had spun was that Harrison had intended for the store to be a family asset, and that I had somehow manipulated the legal paperwork after his death to keep it all for myself while poor Preston faced bankruptcy. People believed it. People who had known me my entire life chose to believe the loud, dramatic lies of my parents over the quiet reality of my grief. I felt like I was suffocating. I stopped going out to get coffee. I stopped checking my mail. I walked around the grocery store with my head down, paranoid that every customer was whispering about me behind my back. My sales dipped slightly because some of the older neighborhood regulars stopped coming in. The psychological toll of being painted as a villain in a story I didn't even write was crushing me. I wasn't eating. I was sleeping maybe 2 hours a night. They were trying to starve me out emotionally, waiting for me to become so isolated and desperate that I would sign the papers just to buy my life back. By the second week of the harassment, I knew I needed professional protection. I made an appointment with Fiona Gallagher, the high-powered estate lawyer who had helped me navigate probate after Harrison died. Fiona was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, sharp as a tack, and completely immune to emotional manipulation. I sat in her sleek office downtown, exhausted, and laid everything out on the table. I told her about the dinner, the ambush at the store, the harassment, and the demands to sign the deed over to Preston. Fiona sat back in her leather chair, steepled her fingers, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she let out a long, heavy sigh. Then, she opened her laptop, typed a few things, and turned the screen toward me. She told me she was glad I came in because she had received a highly irregular fax the day before from a cheap strip mall attorney representing my parents. My eyes scanned the document on the screen. It was a draft for a medical power of attorney and a petition for a conservatorship. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked Fiona what this meant. She explained it to me in plain English. Diane and Wallace were trying to build a legal case that my intense grief over Harrison's death had rendered me mentally unstable and legally incompetent to manage my own finances. They were trying to get a judge to grant them total control over my life, my bank accounts, and the $700,000 commercial property. I thought I couldn't be shocked anymore, but this felt like a physical punch to the gut. They weren't just trying to guilt me. They were actively trying to strip away my basic human rights, to declare me crazy, just to steal my husband's money to pay off Preston's gambling debts. Fiona closed the laptop and looked at me with fierce, unwavering eyes. She told me to breathe. She said they didn't have a leg to stand on. She reminded me that the store's deed was entirely in my name, with no liens, no cosigners, and no loopholes. Harrison had set up an ironclad trust. Furthermore, Fiona said she would happily go to court and shred any amateur lawyer who tried to claim I was incompetent, noting that I had been running a highly profitable business solo for 6 months. She leaned forward and told me that the store was my fortress. They could not touch it legally. But she also warned me that desperate people do dangerous things, and that this psychological warfare would only get worse until I shut it down permanently. Walking out of Fiona's office, something shifted fundamentally inside my brain. The last remnants of daughterly guilt, the lingering sadness over losing my family, completely vanished. They were dead to me. Diane, Wallace, and Preston were no longer my family. They were parasites trying to eat me alive. I realized that just surviving wasn't enough anymore. If I just kept blocking their calls, they would keep coming. I needed to destroy their leverage. I needed to hit them where it actually hurt. Thank you for watching so far. If you are enjoying the story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps push this video to more people who love justice. Thank you so much. That evening, I was sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by old financial documents and tax returns for the store, trying to figure out my next move. The buzzer rang, but this time I didn't answer. I just sat there in the dark. A few minutes later, I heard a key turning in my lock. I jumped up, but it was just Stella. Stella had been my absolute best friend since college. She was a fiery, fiercely loyal woman who worked as a project manager in construction. I had given her a spare key years ago for emergencies. She marched into my apartment holding 2 massive bags of Thai takeout, kicked the door shut, and turned on all the lights. She took one look at my pale face, the dark circles under my eyes, and the papers scattered on the floor, and shook her head. She didn't offer pity. Stella wasn't the pity type. She dropped the food on the coffee table, grabbed me by the shoulders, and told me I looked like absolute garbage. She forced me to sit on the couch, shoved a box of pad thai into my hands, and commanded me to eat. As I forced the food down, I told her everything. The dinner, the public screaming match, the forged power of attorney attempt, the town turning against me. Stella paced the room, her anger vibrating off the walls. She started pulling up memories from our past, laying out the brutal reality of my childhood that I had always tried to justify. She reminded me of my college graduation. I had worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for my degree, graduating with honors. My parents didn't show up to the ceremony because Preston had gotten arrested for a bar fight the night before, and they had to fly to Miami to bail him out. Stella reminded me of the time Preston stole $2,000 from my savings account when I was 22, and when I told my parents, Diane told me to stop causing drama and that family shares. Stella stopped pacing, stood in front of me, and pointed a chopstick at my face. She said my family had been treating me like a doormat for 3 decades. She said they were banking on the fact that I was too polite, too traumatized, and too scared to actually fight back. They thought I would eventually fold because I always folded. Then she asked me the million-dollar question. She asked me what I actually wanted to do with the store. Not what Harrison wanted, not what my parents wanted, but what Clara wanted. I looked at the documents on the floor. I loved the store, but running the daily operations of a grocery business was Harrison's dream. My dream had always been design. I wanted to run my own branding and graphic design studio. I was keeping the grocery floor open because I felt obligated to his ghost, but the truth was, managing inventory and managing produce vendors was killing me slowly. I looked up at Stella, a crazy idea sparking in my mind. I realized I didn't have to keep the physical grocery business to honor Harrison's legacy. I just had to protect the value of what we built and ensure Preston never touched a single cent of it. I told Stella I needed to sell the store, but I needed to sell it to someone very specific. Someone who would ruin Preston's life. Stella smiled, a wicked, brilliant smile, and cracked her knuckles. We had a plan to build. The very next morning, I woke up with a kind of energy I had not felt since Harrison was alive. I did not open the store that day. I put a small sign on the front door apologizing for a sudden maintenance closure, pulled the metal security gates down, and went straight back to my apartment. I made a massive pot of black coffee, sat down at my dining table with my laptop, and went to war. If I was going to sell the store, I was not going to hand it over to some random real estate developer who would bulldoze it and build a generic parking garage. I needed a buyer who would preserve the structure, but more importantly, I needed a buyer who could use the transaction to completely neutralize my family. I started digging into Preston's life. My brother loved to brag, so it was not hard to find information. He had recently been hired at a mid-sized corporate real estate and tech investment firm downtown. I knew for a fact Preston had zero actual skills, so my parents must have pulled some serious strings or called in a massive favor to get him a title there. I looked up the company profile and focused entirely on the founder and chief executive officer. His name was Victor Thorne. Victor Thorne was a legend in the local business community, and not necessarily for being nice. He was known as a ruthless, highly efficient operator who bought up struggling businesses, restructured them, and turned massive profits. Reading through his recent press releases, I noticed a very interesting trend. His firm had recently announced a new initiative to acquire and expand local organic supply chains. They wanted physical retail locations that already had established relationships with local farmers. It was almost too perfect. I had exactly what Victor Thorne was looking for. But a man like him would not take a meeting based on a sob story. He only cared about numbers. So, for the next 48 hours, I barely slept. I pulled 3 years of meticulous financial records. Harrison and I had kept flawless books. I printed out our profit and loss statements, our tax returns, and our exclusive vendor contracts with the top 5 organic farms in the state. I compiled data showing our steady, year-over-year revenue growth, proving that the store generated over $200,000 in pure net profit annually. I put all of this into a sleek, professional leather binder. I was no longer the grieving widow my parents thought they could crush. I was a business owner holding a highly lucrative asset. I drafted a direct, confident email to Victor Thorne's private executive assistant, a contact I found through some deep internet digging. I attached a brief executive summary of the property's valuation and its current cash flow. I did not mention Preston. I simply stated that I owned a turnkey organic retail operation in a prime location, I was looking for a fast cash exit, and I knew his firm was acquiring. I hit send at 2 in the morning. By 9 o'clock the next day, my phone rang. It was the assistant. Mr. Thorne was intrigued and wanted a private meeting the following afternoon. The trap was set. I just needed to lure the shark in. I met Victor Thorne at an exclusive, private golf club on the outskirts of the city. I wore a sharp black blazer, pulled my hair back into a tight bun, and carried my leather binder like a shield. When I was escorted to his table on the outdoor patio, Victor was already there, drinking an espresso and typing on a tablet. He was in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, with eyes that looked like they were constantly calculating the cost of everything around him. He didn't offer small talk. He shook my hand firmly, gestured for me to sit, and immediately asked why I was selling a business that, according to my email, was highly profitable. I looked him dead in the eye and told him the truth, but strictly the business version of it. I told him my husband had passed away, my true passion was graphic design, and I no longer had the desire to manage the day-to-day operations of a grocery supply chain. I slid the thick leather binder across the glass table. Victor opened it and spent the next 20 minutes flipping through the pages in absolute silence. He scrutinized the tax returns, traced the profit margins with his pen, and read through our vendor exclusivity agreements. Finally, he closed the binder, laced his fingers together, and leaned back in his chair. He admitted the numbers were solid, better than most of the acquisitions his team had reviewed that quarter. He asked me what my asking price was. I knew the property and business together were easily worth $700,000 on the open market. But I needed speed and I needed leverage. I told him I would sell him the entire physical property, the inventory, the branding, and the vendor contracts for $650,000 in pure cash. No bank financing contingencies, no dragged-out inspections. I told him I wanted the money in escrow and the deed transferred within 2 weeks. Victor raised an eyebrow. He knew a discount when he saw one, but he also knew that people offering discounts usually had a catch. He asked me what the catch was. I took a sip of my water and laid out my condition. I told him that the building was a 2-story structure. The ground floor was the retail space and loading dock. The upper floor was a massive, open-concept loft that was currently being used as excess storage. I told him that in exchange for the discounted cash price, the finalized sale contract must include an ironclad, 10-year commercial lease guaranteeing me exclusive rights to the entire upper floor for my design studio at a heavily below-market rent. Victor actually chuckled. He appreciated the negotiation. He pointed out that he was getting a fully operational, profitable retail floor, and I was getting a massive cash payout plus a subsidized office space for a decade. He called it a smart play. We spent another hour hammering out the fine details of the lease agreement, the utility splits, and the transition timeline. Right as we were shaking hands to finalize the verbal agreement before the lawyers drew up the paperwork, I paused. I looked at Victor and casually mentioned that I believed one of his new corporate employees, Preston Mitchell, was actually my estranged brother. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. He confirmed that Preston worked in his acquisitions department. I kept my voice completely neutral. I told Victor that my brother was currently under the impression that he was going to inherit this property for free and that he had a severe history of financial mismanagement. I strongly advised Victor to keep this transaction strictly confidential until the ink was dry, and I suggested that once Victor owned the grocery store, he might want to evaluate whether Preston was better suited for corporate investments, or perhaps something more hands-on, like inventory management. Victor stared at me for a long moment, a slow, understanding smirk spreading across his face. He nodded once. The devil's bargain was struck. With Victor Thorne's legal team quietly working at lightning speed to clear the title and draft the closing documents, I had to buy myself 2 weeks of absolute peace from my family. If Diane or Wallace got even a hint that I was liquidating the asset to an outside buyer, they would undoubtedly escalate their harassment, or worse, try to file that fraudulent conservatorship petition to freeze my assets. I needed them docile. I needed them to think they had won. So, I put on the performance of a lifetime. A few days after my meeting with Victor, I waited until I knew my mother would be at her weekly country club luncheon. I called her cell phone and let it go to voicemail. I forced my voice to crack, taking shallow breaths so I sounded like I was crying. I left a pathetic, rambling message. I told her I was so tired. I told her the community backlash was ruining my mental health, that I couldn't sleep, and that I just wanted the fighting to stop. I said I needed a little bit of time to gather my husband's things, but that I was ready to sit down and look at the transfer paperwork for Preston. It worked like a charm. Diane didn't call me back, which was exactly her style. She wanted to let me stew in my surrender. But the nasty voicemails from Aunt Sylvia stopped. Cousin Bethany's passive-aggressive social media posts disappeared. The town gossip quieted down. They all thought the rebellious widow had finally been broken. I used that 2-week window to execute the hardest part of the plan. Late at night, after the store was closed, Stella came over to help me. We methodically packed up every single piece of Harrison's soul that I wanted to keep. We unbolted the beautiful, hand-carved cedar sign that hung behind the register and carried it up the heavy wooden stairs to the second-floor loft. We moved his favorite leather armchair, his collection of vintage coffee mugs, and the framed blueprints of the store. The upper floor was huge, with exposed brick walls and massive industrial windows overlooking the street. For 14 nights straight, I cleaned, painted, and transformed that dusty storage loft into a breathtaking design studio. Every time my muscles ached or I felt a wave of grief hitting me, I just thought about Preston's smug face at the dinner table. It kept me moving. By the end of the second week, the ground floor still looked exactly the same to the untrained eye. The shelves were stocked, the produce was fresh, and the business was humming. But the heart of it, Harrison's true artifacts, were safely locked upstairs behind a steel door that only I had the key to. On Thursday afternoon, Fiona Gallagher called me. The escrow had cleared. $650,000 was sitting safely in my private, secure bank account. The deed was officially recorded in the county clerk's office under Victor Thorne's holding company. My 10-year lease was fully executed and legally binding. Just an hour later, Diane texted me. It was a cold, demanding message. She said she had hired Gloria Price, a local real estate agent, to handle the deed transfer. She told me to be at the store at 10 o'clock sharp the next morning to sign the property over to Preston, or else the lawyers would be involved. I replied with a simple, one-word text. Okay. I set my phone down, poured myself a glass of wine, and smiled for the first time in 6 months. Friday morning arrived with bright, crisp sunshine. I opened the store at 8 o'clock as usual, greeting the morning commuters grabbing their coffee and organic pastries. I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me. I was wearing my favorite tailored dress, my hair done perfectly. I didn't look like a defeated widow, I looked like a woman in charge. At exactly 5 minutes to 10, a silver Mercedes pulled up to the front curb, parking illegally in the loading zone. Out stepped my mother, Diane, wearing a sharp designer suit, looking like she was walking the red carpet. Behind her was my father, Wallace, adjusting his tie with a look of supreme authority. Then came Preston. He was wearing expensive sunglasses indoors, a leather jacket, and chewing gum loudly. He looked like he had already spent the money in his head. Finally, trailing behind them was Gloria Price, a local realtor known for being cheap and asking 0 questions, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest. They walked into the store like an invading army. Diane didn't even say hello. She marched right up to the front register, slammed her hand on the counter, and told me to flip the open sign to closed and lock the door. I calmly told her that this was a place of business, and I wasn't going to turn away paying customers. Wallace stepped forward, his face turning that familiar shade of red. He told me to stop playing games and get the paperwork done so they could get on with their lives. Gloria nervously stepped up to the counter. She smelled strongly of cheap floral perfume. She opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of legal documents. She pushed a blue pen toward me, offering a painfully fake smile. She said it was a standard quitclaim deed, transferring total ownership of the property and the business entity directly to Preston Mitchell for the sum of $0. Preston leaned against the counter, sliding his sunglasses down his nose. He smirked at me and said it was about time I did the right thing. He actually had the nerve to tell me that he would give me a couple of weeks to clear out my junk before he brought contractors in to gut the place. He was already talking about selling the organic refrigeration units to pay off a bookie. I just looked at the pen resting on the counter. I didn't pick it up. I crossed my arms and looked at my mother. I asked her one final time if she really thought this was fair. I asked her if stealing her grieving daughter's only source of income to fund her son's failures was really how she wanted to play this. Diane scoffed loudly. She said I was being melodramatic again. She told me I had plenty of time to find a husband to take care of me, but Preston was in trouble now and family sacrifices for family. She tapped the paper aggressively with her manicured fingernail and yelled at me to sign the damn paper. Right at that exact second, the bell above the door chimed. A massive, sleek black town car had pulled up right behind Diane's Mercedes. The door opened and Victor Thorne stepped out. He was wearing a charcoal gray 3-piece suit, flanked by 2 men holding sleek leather briefcases. He walked into the grocery store, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. The entire energy in the room shifted. Preston froze. His jaw physically dropped. He pulled his sunglasses off, his face suddenly draining of all color. He stammered, taking a step back from the counter. He squeaked out Victor's name, calling him Mr. Thorne and asking what he was doing here. Diane and Wallace looked confused. They had no idea who this imposing man was. Gloria, the cheap realtor, instinctively took a step back, recognizing expensive corporate lawyers when she saw them. Victor didn't even look at Preston yet. He walked straight up to the counter, stood next to me, and placed his hands flat on the wood. He looked at Diane, then at Wallace, and finally down at the quitclaim deed sitting on the counter. He picked up the document, glanced at it, and let out a short, cold laugh. Victor dropped the quitclaim deed back onto the counter as if it were contaminated. He looked at my parents with absolute corporate detachment. He introduced himself as Victor Thorne, the Chief Executive Officer of Thorne Acquisitions. Then he delivered the absolute best sentence I have ever heard in my entire life. He stated, in a perfectly level voice, that the documents they were trying to force me to sign were entirely worthless, because as of 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, his holding company was the sole legal owner of the property, the building, and the business. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Diane blinked rapidly, her brain completely short-circuiting. She looked at me, then at Victor, and stammered that that was impossible. She yelled that I didn't have the authority to sell a family asset. Victor's lawyers stepped forward. One of them opened a briefcase and pulled out a certified copy of the recorded deed. He held it up for Gloria the realtor to see. Gloria took one look at the county seal and the signature, turned pale, packed up her manila folder, and literally scurried out the front door without saying a single word. Wallace lost his mind. He lunged forward, slamming his fists on the counter, screaming at Victor that this was fraud, that he was going to sue him, that he was going to have him arrested. Victor didn't even flinch. He looked at my father like he was an annoying insect. He calmly advised Wallace that if he didn't lower his voice and step back from the counter, he would have him arrested for trespassing on private commercial property. Then, Victor turned his attention to Preston. Preston looked like he was going to throw up. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting back and forth between his boss and his parents. Victor looked him up and down with absolute disgust. Victor told Preston that he had reviewed his employment file that morning. He noted that Preston had missed sales quotas for 3 consecutive months, had been late 12 times, and was generally considered useless by the entire corporate team. Preston tried to apologize, his voice shaking, begging Victor not to fire him in front of his family. Victor smiled a cold, shark-like smile. He said he wasn't going to fire him. He said Thorne Acquisitions prided itself on repurposing assets. Victor announced, right there in front of everyone, that Preston was being officially reassigned. Since the firm now owned a grocery store, they needed manual labor. Victor told Preston that his new title was Assistant Inventory Clerk. His new salary was minimum wage. His duties included unloading the delivery trucks at 4 in the morning, sweeping the retail floor, and scrubbing the public restrooms. If Preston refused the reassignment, it would be considered a voluntary resignation, meaning he would not be eligible for unemployment benefits, and his creditors would be notified immediately. I thought Diane was going to faint. She grabbed her chest, screaming at Victor that he couldn't treat her son like a janitor. Victor simply turned his back on her, looked at me, and asked if my upstairs studio was ready. I smiled, a genuine, radiant smile, and pulled a shiny new key out of my pocket. I told him it was absolutely perfect. I looked at my family one last time. They were completely broken. The arrogance, the threats, the entitlement, all of it had been shattered into a million pieces. I walked out from behind the counter, headed toward the private staircase leading to my 10-year lease sanctuary, and told them all to have a wonderful day. The following 2 months were the most poetic justice I could have ever asked for. I spent my days upstairs in my beautiful, sunlit studio. I threw myself into my graphic design business. Without the crushing weight of managing the grocery floor, my creativity exploded. I partnered with my best friend Stella, and we started landing massive branding contracts with local restaurants and boutique shops. But the real entertainment was right downstairs. Victor Thorne was a man of his word, and he was absolutely brutal. Preston actually showed up for the warehouse job, mostly because his loan sharks were breathing down his neck, and he had literally no other options. Every morning at 4:30, while I was brewing my espresso upstairs, I could hear the heavy diesel engines of the delivery trucks out back. I could look out my window and watch Preston, the former golden boy who used to wear designer suits and look down on everyone, dragging heavy pallets of organic soil and crates of cabbages through the rain. He looked miserable. He lost weight, his hair was always a mess, and his fake charm was completely gone. He was also spectacularly terrible at the job. Preston had never done a day of hard labor in his life. Within the first 3 weeks, he left a pallet of premium organic avocados sitting on the loading dock in the blazing afternoon sun because he was busy taking a personal phone call. The entire shipment rotted, costing the store thousands of dollars. I would occasionally walk downstairs to grab a sparkling water from the coolers, purely to enjoy the view. Preston would see me, his face turning a dark shade of purple, but he couldn't say a word. If he harassed a customer or a tenant, Victor had made it clear he would be terminated with cause. He had to stand there, wearing a green canvas apron over a stained t-shirt, and watch me live my best life in the building he thought he was going to steal. The breaking point happened right before Thanksgiving. I was walking downstairs to meet a client when I heard shouting near the cash registers. Preston was having a full-blown temper tantrum. A customer had asked him to check the back room for a specific brand of almond milk, and Preston had snapped, screaming at the woman that he wasn't her personal servant. Unfortunately for Preston, Victor Thorne's head of retail operations happened to be doing a surprise inspection that exact day. The operations manager stepped out from the back office, witnessed the entire screaming match, and didn't even hesitate. He walked right up to Preston, told him to take off the apron, and fired him on the spot. I watched Preston walk out the front doors, his shoulders slumped, completely defeated, with absolutely nothing to show for his arrogance. While Preston was failing spectacularly at sweeping floors, Diane and Wallace were desperately trying to claw their way out of the grave they had dug. They hired a slightly more expensive lawyer and filed a civil lawsuit against me and Victor Thorne's holding company, claiming the sale of the store was executed under extreme duress and fraud. It was a completely desperate, baseless lawsuit, but the legal system requires you to show up anyway. We were ordered to attend a mandatory mediation session before the judge would even look at the case. We all sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room in a downtown law office. I sat on one side of the long mahogany table with Fiona Gallagher and Victor's corporate legal team. Diane and Wallace sat on the other side. They looked 10 years older. The stress of Preston's debts and the legal fees were clearly eating them alive. Their lawyer started giving a passionate, entirely fabricated speech about how I had suffered a mental breakdown after my husband's death and how Victor Thorne had swooped in as a corporate predator to steal a family heirloom. He demanded the sale be reversed immediately. Fiona let him talk for about 10 minutes. Then, she opened her briefcase. She didn't yell. She didn't pound the table. She just started sliding documents across the polished wood. First, she slid over the heavily discounted rent agreement for my 10-year lease, proving the deal was highly beneficial to me. Next, she slid over the bank records proving I had received $650,000 in cash, proving no fraud had occurred. Then, Fiona pulled out the kill shot. She slid over the faxed copy of the fraudulent conservatorship petition that Diane and Wallace had tried to file behind my back a month prior. Fiona looked directly at my parents' lawyer. Her voice was pure ice. She informed him that his clients had attempted to file a medical power of attorney without a single doctor's signature, purely to seize control of an asset they did not own. She stated that if they did not drop this civil suit immediately and sign a permanent restraining order, she would take those forged documents to the district attorney and press criminal fraud charges against both Diane and Wallace. I watched the color completely drain from their lawyer's face. He looked at the forged document, looked at Diane, and realized his clients had lied to him and put his own legal license at risk. He immediately asked for a recess. 10 minutes later, they came back into the room. The lawsuit was dropped with prejudice. My parents were ordered to cover all of Fiona's legal fees, which amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. As they walked out of the room, completely broke and facing total ruin, Wallace refused to look at me. Diane was quietly sobbing. I felt absolutely nothing for them. It has been 6 months since that day in the mediation room. A lot has changed, and yet, the things that matter most have stayed exactly the same. The financial fallout completely destroyed my parents. Between paying off the violent bookies that Preston owed money to and covering the massive legal fees from their failed lawsuit against me, they drained their entire retirement savings. They couldn't afford the mortgage on the big suburban house I grew up in anymore. A few weeks ago, I heard through the grapevine that they sold the house at a loss and moved 2 states away to live in a tiny apartment near Aunt Sylvia. Preston is apparently sleeping on their couch, working a night shift at a gas station. They're entirely out of my life, and the silence is beautiful. As for me, I am thriving. My design agency, Mitchell & Clark Creative, is booming. Stella and I had to hire 2 junior designers just to keep up with the workload. Every morning, I walk up the stairs to my massive studio. The sunlight pours through the industrial windows, illuminating the hand-carved cedar sign that Harrison made. I run my fingers over his name, and I don't feel that crushing, suffocating grief anymore. I feel peace. I feel pride. Victor Thorne turned out to be an excellent landlord. He completely renovated the ground floor, bringing in an organic coffee bar that tripled the foot traffic. We actually get along quite well, mostly because we both respect a good, ruthless business deal. Sometimes, he sends a free espresso up to my studio. I protected my husband's legacy. I didn't keep the physical inventory, but I kept the value of what we built, I kept the space where we fell in love, and I kept my independence. I cut the toxic infection out of my life, and for the first time in 30 years, I am breathing my own air. I am living for myself, not for the approval of people who only saw me as a tool to fix their own mistakes. So, looking back at the wreckage of my family's greed and the beautiful life I've managed to rebuild from the ashes of it, I have to ask you all. Was I wrong for completely cutting them off and selling the property out from under them, or should I have tried to find a more peaceful way to make them understand? Thank you for watching my story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button for more daily drama and let me know your verdict in the comments below.